My name is Jade, and I'm teaching at Chongqing University, Salvador University in Chongqing. And our team also participate in the rural reconstruction movement in China. And why we involved in this movement? That's because we have a historical review about China's economic history, and then we think that actually the rural community actually is our hope. How can China avoid any economic crisis from the global crisis, because we have land revolution, and also we have very strong rural community. But so we help rural community strength enough to resist the global crisis. That is our basic position. And when we are looking into the New China history, we find that because we also pursue the industrialization and financialization, but whenever we have crisis, and how can we solve this crisis? When we mean crisis, we mean fiscal deficit, debt, inflation, and unemployment. How can China solve this so-called the urban crisis or the economic crisis? Because we have transferred those crises, the cause of crisis, to the rural sector. So we think that whenever the crisis can be transferred to rural society, that means we have the so-called the soft landing. And on the other hand, if not, then we have the so-called the hard landing in urban society, in the cities. And so we think that the rural community actually acts as a social stabilized. If you travel to China, mainly you travel to mega city like Beijing, Shanghai, but I encourage you to visit the inland China, because this is our majority people living there. And then we have small peasantry and also rural communities. That wise, when we talk about the real China, actually we should look into the rural community, how they live in the inland province or the western region or northwest region. And we, whenever the China can solve the crisis, that means the Chinese government can adopt a policy of land distribution and also practice the small peasant economy. And we have the so-called the question of the Sanlong. It means peasants, rural society, and agriculture. This is a very important issue in when we discuss what's the problem of China confronts. And our research are based on Professor Wen Te-jin's books and also the whole research team. And he published a book called Ba Ci Wei Ji. It analyzed the 8 main crises in New China since 1949. However, our research team, working under the Professor Wen's supervision, and then we add 2 more economic crises. One is happened in 1949 to 1951, and the latest one is it happened since the 2012 until 2016. But of course, we will say that we also within the crisis, but how we try to solve that crisis is I will give you more details about this our argument. And we divide the 10 crises into 2 types. The first 7 that occurred before the mid-1990s arose when industrialization of foreign capitals, and then a structural imbalance in the domestic economic system. And that means why we have that 7 crises, because we introduce foreign capital from not only from the Soviet Union, but after that we also introduce capital from the West, from the Western country and also Japan. So we have that crisis because whenever the developing country introduce capital, that means borrow money and then you have to pay. And then how can you pay the money in terms of the dollar? And then that dollar, the exchange rate always controlled by the developed countries. So in that situation, developing countries like China even have very high economic growth. We still face the crisis, repeat and repeat. But how can we avoid? How can we prevent? That's because we have the land distribution, or because of the land revolution in 1949, and we still enjoy these benefits. And for the last three crises, we have that crisis because this is all imported crisis. That means the original root is happened in the Western country, in the core country. It's not in China, but we import it into our countries. And now, how China deal with the foreign capital is still a very is still a challenge for us. Whenever you have capital flow or capital control, it's because Chinese government have to deal with this crisis, because that's crisis across many social crises and also the social problem. And the first crisis, when we examine the first crisis during the early beginnings of New China, we found that New China also faced the two questions. One is the high inflation that is caused by the previous regime is coming down. And also another question is because we as a developed country still want to pursue industrialization. So we have the problem of how we do the primitive capital accumulation for the development of the national capitalism. Because even the Mao Zedong said that at the very beginning, we practiced the so-called the national capitalism. And but how the New China can resolve the crisis? Because, as I mentioned before, we have the land revolution, and that's the over 88% of the population delink themselves from the urban crisis of modernization or inflation in megacity like Shanghai at that time. At that time, in Shanghai, there are lots of problems, particularly financial chaotics. But how China solved this, I will tell you later. As I mentioned, this is very important, how China can avoid 10 crises until now, because for other developed countries, very few countries can achieve this land redistribution or land revolution. This is also the agenda of the Communist Party in the 20th century. So in Brazil, you also have heard about the landless workers movement, Sendeha, and because now Brazil hasn't finished the land revolution and then still have the land issue, and then that land issue also hasn't resolved in many developed countries. You find that in Nepal, in Colombia, particularly in Latin America. So this is very key issue, how China can solve the crisis. And as I mentioned, during the early beginnings of New China, Shanghai at that time has the problem of financial chaotics and the hyperinflation. How can deal with this? As I mentioned, at that time, the Chinese government sent the People's Liberation Troops to close down the stock market. But maybe you think that this is impossible because military is supposed to the kind of violence. How can Chinese government did that? But if you think about in that context, I mean, at that time, the People's Liberation Army actually belongs to the people, and then at that time, the popular trust in the military. So at that time, the Chinese government closed down the stock market, and also the carry out the land redistribution. That means not all the majority live in the city. They can have a land and house in the countryside, though they don't need to depend on the market, on the urban. So can you imagine? For example, in Brazil, we have many favelas, slum slum. And then so many crowded in the city. If Brazil practice the land redistribution, that means at least the majority can access to the land and have food and also shelter. This is very important for the popular. And and also another problem, that is how we deal with the foreign capital. We have the capital from Soviet Union, and why? Because the Korean War happened, and this is because the geopolitics question. We introduced the Soviet Union introduced capital and to strengthen the military alliance between the Soviet Union and China. And at the same time, we have the opportunity to have the industrialization, but this is a healthy industrialization. That means we produce machine gun, tank, but not domestic device like electronics, like food or shoes nowadays we produce. At that time, we have the heavy industrialization. But so from the poster, you find that the Soviet expert helped the Chinese worker to have the build a factory and then have that heavy industrialization. But however, because the Soviet Union still want to control the military base in China, the port and also the railway system. However, the Mao Zedong at that time say no. That means refuse Soviet Union request. So at that time, Soviet Union stopped capital, stop to send capital again. So at that time, China has the problem. How can she continues the industrialization? And that is one the problem. And another, it happens during the 1960s. How can we want still continue industrialization because it needs intensive capital, but we don't have it because Soviet Union stopped it. And then how can we solve the crisis? At that time, Mao Zedong sent the free ways to send the free race youth to the countryside. Though at that time, so we have the So we have three ways of sending. Sorry, wait a minute. Yeah. I'm provide a historical and macro view about the China history, particularly economic history, and also how China solved the problem. I will argue that because we have the small peasantry and also the rural communities. And as I mentioned, how Mao Zedong solved the crisis at the very beginning because he practiced the land redistribution. And then the second time, he sent all the youth, particularly the urban youth, and at that time they were unemployed, and then they sent to the countryside. No. So during the 1960s, we have the so-called Cultural Revolution. But at that time, what's the real experience is that at that time, lots of the young people were unemployed. And then how they solved this urban crisis, because so many unemployed young stuck in the city. How can you do it? Because we, at that time, Mao Zedong still have very high authority. And then he said that, okay, all the young people went to go to the countryside because our tradition that we should integrate with the peasant and workers. So on the one time, he make use of the Chinese tradition because as an intellectual, we should work with the peasant and workers. And on the other side, the communist tradition also have this because we also encourage the communist young people go to the countryside, work together with the poor, particularly the peasant and workers. So at that time, there are three ways of movement. So around the three times, so about the 40 million young people all went to the countryside. And of course, this is why we also think that why we have, at the same on the one time, it solved, of course, the national crisis. But on the other hand, also have the opportunity for the young people to understand what's happened in the rural society. So, however, after 1970s, particularly it happened in 1972, we have the so-called Ping-Pong Diplomacy. At that time, the China already shifted from Soviet Union to the West. And at the same time, we also have the capital. We introduced capital from the West and also later from Japan. And at that time, we have the so-called two plans, the 43 plans and also the 82 plans. What does it mean? It means we introduced the projects worth 83 4.3 billion US dollar, and also 8.2 billion US dollar. But it's so huge amount of money, and how can we pay? It's very difficult. So at that time, we also have debt problem, external debt, and also have the inflation. And once again, during that period, then also again practice the continue the or practice the policy of land distribution. That means let the peasant has their own land. Why I say that? Because during the we have the so-called national industrialization. We have people's commune. At that time, all land, the state collects all the land from the peasants. And during then, he practiced the land redistribution again. But why you think that? Why peasant? Sometimes you have the land, and sometimes you give the land to the government or to the party, because the peasant also think that they trust in Communist Party. Whenever they have the land, or to let the state or the government or the party, because three in one, they also think that even I give you the land, but you also promise my livelihood. So they always has trust. This trust sometimes is broken, but in general, the majority still believes in Communist Party. So why the Communist Party still enjoy the authority or popularity nowadays? That's it, because they also secure the peasant, the majority have their own land. If not, they still have the government still promise or still guarantee their basic livelihood. This is I mean in general speaking. So at that time, we have the so-called the recovery of rural economy, not national, but the rural economy and also township village enterprise at that time is very strong, and then it become the pillar of the Chinese economy. But at the same time, during the 1990s, we have the so-called the overproduction, the problem of overproduction. But how we solve this? Because of time limit, I speak it fast. We have the first way of overproduction. We produce a lot, and then how can we solve it? And the Chinese government at that time, is Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and then they have the so-called the Great West project, and also the revival the East China project. That means they try to shift the production to the northeast and also shift to the inland province. So at that time, we have the so-called the Great Western Development. It started in 1999, and a total of investment of RMB 3.6 trillion. And also, we have the Northeast Revival Project in 2001, and we have total investment of RMB 2.4 trillion. That means during that period, we have the China tried to, because of we have to solve the problem of overproduction, but at the same time, we also solve the problem of the regional development, because you know that we all have investment, particularly along the coastal area. So you have defined the mega city in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. But during 1990s, the Chinese invest a lot in the inland province. So they solved the problem of the regional development. And then, how can we solve the global crisis in 2008? Because before 2 years, Chinese government already have the policy of the Sino New Deal. Why this policy? Because at that time, as I mentioned, we have the problem of the overproduction. So the Chinese government also invests a lot in the countryside. And it's become the top priority of a top agenda of the not only Communist Party and also the whole country. So, when last year or in 2008 we have the world have the global crisis, and Chinese also have the problem of the factory bankruptcy, and also we have a lot of the peasant workers. They went to the city, they worked there, but suddenly you couldn't find job anymore, particularly in 2008. So all peasant workers can remove or to return to their countryside, to their home village. Why? Because they have their own land, their home housing, and also shelter, and also parents and families in the countryside. Why? Because we have 1949 land revolution. So that's why China can solve crisis once again and again, because we still keep the policy of land with distribution, and we still have majority living in the countryside. And last year, Xi Jinping, the new president, he announced that we have the policy of rural regeneration. He clearly stated that we should continue or adopt this policy, policy of rural regeneration. That means he continues what Mao and what Deng has done before. Whenever we have crisis, and then we should have keep our rural society stronger to resist the global crisis or external crisis. So this is how we solve the internal crisis. And for the another, then because we have the crisis at the second wave of overproduction, how we solved it? We have the mega projects, One Belt, One Road. That means it's the root, because we have the second wave of overproduction. How we can solve it? Because in the past, the Western countries solved it through the war, but Chinese government tried to solve it to continue industrialization, help the other developing countries along the road or around the New Silk Road, to help them to construct their infrastructure, to help them, because the industrialization in developed countries is not so strong enough. But this is very controversial. Because it also allows many problems, particularly interest conflicts, but from Chinese government perspective, it's also one of the solutions to solve the problem of the overproduction. So we have the one external mega project. At the same time, we have internal, how to keep our rural society strong enough. And based on the what we analyzed, so our team involved in the rural reconstruction for the past 15 years. And then we think that how can we strengthen our rural community is very important, because whenever we have crisis, we still have the rural society for us, for the majority to live, and then to enjoy comparative stability. So that is our argument. Thank you very much.
And then now I would like to tell you two stories about the women. The two women, how they can protect the environment of China and let the desert become to be an oasis, and then the polluted river to turn to be a very green river. And now I would like to tell you the story about Yeung. Yeung initiated the formation of the Greenhouse River, and then Environmental Protection organized in 2002. She has put tremendous efforts into raising public awareness and concern in Hanyun Sanfan City. As a result, the water quality of the Han River, which is at the source of China's South-North Water Transfer Project, has been improved. Yeung Jenny, once a high school teacher, retired in 1988 at the age of 55, like me. At this turning point in her life, she decided to become a volunteer in environmental protection, which was a great surprise to her family and colleagues. In 2002, she initiated the formation of Green Han River, which virtually no resources whatever, and devoted herself wholeheartedly to environmental protection. She said, "People who knows me understand that it is because I care, while those who do not know me wonder that what I am after." When she first began her engagement with the Green Movement, people's awareness of environmental issues was minimal. Many people failed to understand her. Others thought that she was crazy, that she mad. Government officials thought she was too noisy, talked too much, while factory owners hate her. "Why you always complain us?" Jenny visited villages, factories, and mountainous areas along the Han River to investigate the resources of the pollution. She wrote over 100 reports and submitted more than 10 motions to the governments. As a result of the public education work of Jenny's Green Group, people's awareness of environment protection issues was much enhanced. Efforts by environmental protection has improved, and many small paper factories were closed down. Jenny introduced environmental protection education to campus, communities, and villages. Reaching people over 60,000 people. The group has employed different approaches for different target communities, making their work more effective. The volunteer team in Xin Sanfan became larger and larger, with the members ages from kindergarten, you see, primary school, no matter, and age to over 80. People name her Sister Yeung of Environmental Protection, and children call her Environmental Protection Granny. What he has done is only by heart. Why my hometown river is so polluted, cannot survive by only a fish. What he has done is only what, this is my home river. I want to have my home river clean and not polluted, and I can drink the water. There is another story of the woman, the protection of the environment. Yin Yuzhen has worked with an indomitable spirit of years, turning this desert area into an oasis. With more than now 500,000 trees, 400 sheep, 30 cows, over nearly 35 acres, seeking expert advice with various other resources, and by holding family symposiums. She created a scientific method for effective sand area visualization. She said, "I would rather die of fatigue from fighting the sand than be bullied by the sand and wind. I should survive in the desert because her home is in the desert." And then he only doesn't want to bully by the sand and wind, and let my family members and live in dignity. That is the story of her. In 1985, Yin Yuzhen, a 20-year-old woman, I think she's very beautiful, so I met her. From Shanxi province, married and moved into the interior of Musan Desert in the inner Mongolia, to an area named Janbeitan in Wushanqi. The adverse natural conditions were unimaginable. You cannot imagine that the sand and then the wind blow her home. The home is only like a cave. You can bow down to live in. desert home, and then no people around his desert area, her desert area. And the sand was ubiquitous. All that they saw, touched, stepped on, at home or outside, was all the same. The wind blew the grains into the ears and mouth. When the storm stopped, the deadly silence was haunting. Only Yin and husband lived in the area. The second day of the arrival, she made up her mind to fight the ability to the death and not to oppressed by the abominable conditions. In the second spring of her marriage, Yeung began to dig irrigation ditches for water. But the storm blew away the ditches in the winter. She tried the sunflower stem to prevent the wind by destroying them. The following spring, she dug ditches, planting 5,000 willow trees. However, the grains again destroyed her efforts. Learning from their failures, that she tried not to do so? No. She discovered the scientific methods of planting trees and enabling them to survive. For over 10 years, Yin Yuzhen has fought the tough weather conditions of the desert and has overcome the storm, the shifting sand, and other difficulties with such as hardworking conditions, inconvenient transportation, and inadequate funds. No money for her. She performed the miracle of preventing and controlling sand over a total area 10,000 acres and discovered an advanced scientific method of sand prevention, which is effective for the local conditions, never discouraged by failure. She has not only improved her living conditions and changed her fate, but also motivated many peasants and husbandmen join her in our foresting the desert. She has made an immense contribution to project by sand control and prevention in China. Because after the tank crisis, and then there is also many women invisible to do the protection of the China environment. And some of the women will also done very good job to the animals' rights and then for the ovens. Thank you.
叫严小辉，我来自中国，然后主要在过去10多年，在中国的农村从事乡村建设工作。然后刘建之是我的老师，我现在跟他读 PhD， 然后薛翠是我的师姐。
Okay, my name is Xiaohui. I come from China, and for the past 15 years, I'm involved in rural reconstruction movement. So we are the team, and we, as I mentioned, the rural reconstruction because we have many done. I add some information for you, and then we have initiated many projects, and then for example, we help the peasant organize the cooperatives, and then we also initiate some rural-urban fair trades, and also we provide training programs for peasants and how to raise the pig in an ecological way, and also we initiate some natural farming, and but now. Xiaohui is pursuing his PhD with Professor Lau Qinqi in Lingnan University in Hong Kong. And since we are fellow, because I'm also graduate from Lingnan University, so we are fellow students. Yeah. Okay.
我今天借这个机会，想分享一点关于中国的，尤其是土地方面的问题，关于这个农村和城市之间。因土地差别形成的这个分化有关的问题。
I'm very glad I have an opportunity to share with you about the China land policy and also the questions of the urban-rural polarization in today China.
今年是中国开展这个改革开放40周年。然后过去40年，中国在全世界看起来这个经济方面获得了非常好的、非常高速的发展，但是在国内，农村和城市在这40年当中也出现了 越来越大的这个极端的分化。
This year, 2018, is the 40th anniversary of the policy of open door and reform, 改革开放, the reform and open door policy. And in the dominant media or the popular speaking, we found that China enjoyed very high economic growth. It seemed that very prosperity and very good. But however, actually the rural society, particularly the the relation between the urban and city actually has changed a lot. And particularly the rural society has suffered the problem of the rural-urban polarization.
虽然在世界范围内，这个城乡之间的差别、区域差别都是非常普遍的，但是中国这种城乡的分化，有一个最基础的一个因素就是土地制度。
It's quite popular that the relation, the polarity between the urban and between the city and the countryside is very big. There's a huge gap. It's quite popular among the world, but China has also this problem. But there's one difference.
新中国的建立，中国革命区别于世界上其他多数地区的革命，一个显著的特点就是国家彻底完成了对土地的改革。
What's the difference from China? China difference from the other countries because China has finished or complete the land distribution. This is the land system. That is makes China different from other countries. The key issue is the land system.
并且在土地革命完成之后，再通过30年的时间，国家完全控制了所有的土地。
Because of land distribution, the state or the government actually control all the land in China.
所以在改革开放40年前，中国就出了在宪法里边有一个非常重要的规定，在宪法里边，就是中国所有的城市的土地都属于国家，所有农村的土地都属于集体。
In the constitution law of China, the urban land belongs to the state, and the rural land belongs to the village committee. It's a collective ownership. It's difference.
所以，在城市的土地要搞任何的建筑，要把土地转让出去，它的使用权进行出租，所有的这些收益都是国家和政府的。
So if the government want to make use of the land, or for example, to have cooperation with business company, but all the profits all belongs to the government because government control the land.
所以政府的财政收入通过转让出租土地的这个收入，在总体上占到超过一半，就财政收入的一半以上，在这10几年。
So for the past several years, the revenue of the Chinese government actually depends on the land revenue. Is account for is about the half. Half of the revenue come from the land tax. I can say that.
但是在农村，农民的土地是不允许转让和出售的。
But it is forbidden to sell the land, to sell the rural land. Rural land is forbidden to sell in the market.
但是政府可以向农民征地，把农民的集体土地征收为国家用地以后，他再进行交易出让。
However, Chinese government can confiscate rural land from peasants and to do the land lease or to land transfer. to do the land transaction. Yeah.
所以农民要通过土地获得的就是土地的收益非常少，只是很低的一部分。然后国家通过把农民的土地转成国家所有，然后在出让以后可以获得很高额的收益。
So the peasant gets profit, a small profit from that kind of transaction. However, the Chinese government can get a high part of the big amount of the profit from during the land transaction.
也是因为这个状况，城市经济在不断的增长，所以就吸纳了很多农村来的农民作为劳动力，所以在农村地区失去土地的农民就到城市里边打工为生。
So the Chinese government also make use of this policy because the Chinese government can confiscate the land from the peasants, and then to do the land transaction or land transfer, they can make a lot of money and also to have land tax and get the land higher land revenues.
这种状况在过去经济是持续增长的情况下，还保持的可以。农民在城里边通过打工可以有相对比较好的收益，还可以在农村维持一种基本稳定的生活。
So even the peasant lose their land, however, they can find the jobs in the cities. So to a certain extent, they also can have a basic livelihood.
但是当经济下降的时候，尤其这几年，城市的这个自身的问题不断暴露出来，而且中国也在整个工业产业的结构供给侧进行调整。然后再进行产业的升级，在这个情况下，城市越来越不能吸纳过去从农村就是因失去土地走向城市的这些打工群体。
However, if the Chinese economy declines, and then that the peasant workers will find it difficulties because once they already lose their land, and at the same time they became unemployed. So at that time, they have some difficulties.
所以中国有超过1/4的人口，总人口的1/4是在城市和农村之间流动的。
So over 1/4 of the whole population of China, how I say, they are floating, so-called the floating population, floating from city to the countryside and from countryside to the city, always float.
所以这个数量大概接近3个亿，然后他们是平常在城市里边工作，在农忙的时候还回到农村，然后种地和务农，然后每年就是在城市和农村之间这样流动一次。
The total number of the peasant workers nowadays are around the 3个亿对吧
？3个亿。
300 million. 300 million. 300 million. That kind of so-called the floating population. Whenever, sometimes they did farming in the countryside, and sometimes they work in the cities. Whenever they can find jobs in the city. If not, they go back to the home village, or during the spring festival, they go back to visit their families there.
但是新的状况是，城市在进行产业升级，越来越不需要这些打工的群体。农村的土地已经被国家和一些企业开始征占，所以这些农民很可能在城市里边失去工作，在农村里边也没有土地。
But now there's a big challenge for peasant workers because on the one time China has the problem of the structuring of industry. That means they don't need the rural labor anymore because they have to increase the or to expand the service economy or tertiary industry. No more manufacturing industry. So they don't need a lot of peasant workers. And at the same time, they lose the rural land because some business grabbed the land and then they built they did some business, or that means they also they grabbed some lands from peasants. So that group of peasants has the problem because they already lose their land in the countryside. At the same time, they couldn't find jobs in the city. So that group of landers have the more difficulties.
我们过去15年都是在农村不同的，在国内不同的地区开展这种乡村建设的工作。但是今天，尤其是最近这3年以来，就我们刚才谈到的这种情况是越来越严重，并且我们开展乡村建设一个最基础的问题就是农民对土地的这个使用和把握越来越弱。
We found that that problem becomes more serious. So particularly because we involved in the rural reconstruction movement, and then we found that issue become very serious, because the key issue is how we have to deal with the questions of how the peasant relate to the land, to the earth, to the land, their homeland. So if they lose their homeland, and then how can they reconstruct their home again?
中国在过去就是维持，虽然农村有城乡差别，维持社会稳定的一个最基本的原因，就是所有的农民几乎都有住房，在农村有住房，然后多数的就是在80年代以前出生的农民都有土地，所以他们在城市里边，无论是发生什么状况，能不能赚到钱，工作的情况如何，当他们回到农村的时候，都会有房子住和有地可以种，这是过去的一个好的基础。
Because China has the dual system, that means we have different policy towards the land in the city and in the countryside. So all the peasants, students, they are entitled to have land, to have housing in their home village. So they can come to the city to find a job. If not, they can go back to their home village. So at least they have choice, have two choice. But now the choice has no more, particularly to some group of people, some groups of peasants.
所以我们谈到的最近几年的变化和新的发展状况，实际上是对这种基础的一种开始动摇。
So our movement also have to encounter this problem, particularly to those group of the landless peasants.
然后，在去年中国的最高层的第19大这个会议上，就是中共中央提出来乡村振兴的战略。
Last year, Chinese Communist Party has the 19th Congress, and then Xi Jinping declared the policy of rural regeneration.
所以这个战略是对过去很长一段时间这种城市化、工业化和现代化的某一种意义上的反思和否定。
To a certain extent, this new policy actually tried to criticize or to reflect China for the past 30 years what had done before.
在前几天的同样一个大会上，习近平提出来，他主动在最高层的会议上提出来逆城市化的这个考虑，认为城市化和逆城市化应该平衡，就是多样共存。
And in a similar conference, Xi Jinping also mentioned how to need to the urbanization,
或者去城市化。
or the industrialization. That means he promote rural regeneration. That means, to a certain extent, it means the urbanization, the industrialization.
所以现在整个中国的社会发展，尤其是在大家比较热点的区域，都是在围绕乡村振兴这个战略开始往农村去看。
So nowadays, many sectors like government, business, and all focus on the new policy because new policy it mentioned rural regeneration, so become hot topics.
国家在政策上就是已经提出来，农村的过去这种土地制度还要再延长30年，基本是要保障农民的基本的土地的这个稳定。
And then one of the core content of the rural regeneration policy, it guarantees the peasants continue have the land land contract. You know that the ownership, the land ownership belong to the village committee. Peasants only have the right of land use, not the ownership, only the right of land use. So the government continue 30 years more the right of land use for peasants.
但是同时，就是越来越多的企业资本家开始顺应这个政策，也是进入到农村进行大规模的圈地和开发的工作。
However, the capitalists, financial capitalists or industrial capitalists, also make use of or take advantage of this policy. I mean, rural regeneration policy. And then in the name of this policy, try to do the land grabbing from the peasants.
这其中一个更显著的特点就是这一次用金融的手段就是越来越把土地作为吸纳金融的手段，然后农村的土地也越来越跟这种货币增发和金融挂钩。
And because of the financialization, because nowadays the financialization becomes increase a lot. Financial economy becomes the financialization become more and more popular in China, and then they try to do the land financialization. That means on the one time they increase a lot of money, the cash, renminbi. That means and then through this process, they try to do the speculation on the land.
所以一方面我们是很期待国家对乡村振兴战略的这一系列的政策，同时也是在担忧，就是新的，就是利用金融手段的这种资本的方式进入到农村，可能会带来新的问题。
Of course, because we involved in rural reconstruction movement, we welcome this new policy, rural regeneration. But at the same time, we also worry about the financial capitalism because they also target on the rural land, and then to do the land financialization of land. That means land will be will be speculated by the financial capitalism.
所以我们接下来的工作也是主要跟政府合作，在一些农村地区开展这种乡村振兴的工作，然后只是希望，能够利用乡村原有的社会的文化的基础，比较综合性的、慢一点的推动一个社区的建设，而不是大规模的这种拆除和建设。 所以这是我们当前也在开展的工作。
So now we try to initiate projects to work together with the local government and the local communities to have the integrated projects to help them to reconstruct their community and then not to involve in any so-called the large scale project or the demolishment or to some kinds of, because in some cases some business company always to do the land grab and then to build many luxury house and then to attract more tourists to the countryside and do this kind of a tourist-oriented tourism, but not bring a benefit to the local community. So our project is different from that this kind of the tourism. And then we really want to help the local community rebuild, and also to integrate more sectors, local government, local communities, and also from the outsider, like the intellectual, student, and teachers. So it's an integrated project, not profit-oriented.
谢谢。
Thank you.
So, I will be giving the last presentation, and then we will be inviting your comments. So just now, we've heard the presentation by Xiaohui, and he is the manager of the Little Donkey Farm in China, and he has been involved in the rural reconstruction movement since he was a university student. And now he's a father of a 3-year-old, and he's already been in the movement for about 15 years. So in China, we see a very vibrant group of young people who come from the rural background, have studied in the universities, and then they would be doing the volunteer work to be working for the peasants. So it is something similar to the kind of a campaign during the Cultural Revolution when young people are sent to the countryside. But at that time, it was basically the government policy to deal with unemployment in the cities, and with maybe in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution years. So in between 66 and 68. And so there was a coercive factor, a coercive element in that kind of campaign during the Cultural Revolution. But then in these last decade, we have this voluntary, going to the countryside of the young people to work with the villagers. And so and for the rural reconstruction movement in China, we have also been organizing training sessions and discussion groups for university students. So in almost every university in China, they have a student group which would attend to the rural issues. But of course, if we look at China's modernization in the last 3 decades or 4 decades since the reform period, we have seen a lot of contradictions. The contradictions come from this the felt necessity for China's modernization to catch up, the so-called catch up with the modern powers, and the vision of catching up was there was no other possibility except capitalist way of modernization. So we see in China in the last 4 decades since the reform, the rapid urbanization. And a few years ago already, we have over 50% of the population being urbanized. And we see also a process of industrialization where we have a lot of small and medium industries, especially in the first 2 decades of the reform period. We had a lot of the towns and township and village enterprises. And in a way, they were a kind of industrialization which would give more income to the rural population. But on the other hand, then we had a lot of consequences. And the most important of that was the ecological question. Because of the mining, because of the industries, the paper industries, textile industries, so a lot of rivers, streams were polluted. And so in the last 40 years, especially in the first 30 years after the reform, we see China with a very rapid growth in terms of 2-digit percentage of the GDP. And in the last 10 years or so, then the government has adjusted it so that the GDP growth would be about 7 or 8%. Still, we see China developing. And in many ways, it seems to serve as an example for emerging countries, for the less developed countries. But then, on the other hand, if we look at the development from the perspective of the majority of the population, especially the migrant peasant workers, or the women, or the indigenous, or the ethnic minorities, then we find that there is also a very huge cost to this kind of modernization. And the cost would be in terms of, on the one hand, the socioeconomic aspect, where you see people, of course, getting more income, but then they also have to spend more on education, especially on medical expenses, and on housing, on transport. It's not so much, but still, all the kind of livelihood expenses are increasing. So on the one hand, there is a little bit more income, but then on the other hand, the burden of education and health had been on the population until a few years ago, when the government started to have the health schemes and also the educational programs to support especially the poor in the countryside. So we see that generally, there seems to be a rise in the living standard, and China can pride itself on the Millennium Goals of reducing poverty. It is one of the few countries that managed to achieve the Millennium Goals of reducing poverty, extreme poverty by half before the year 2015. But at the same time, for us, then it is important to see what the people, the majority of the people are paying, the kind of cost they are paying, the kind of damage that has been done to them through this particular trajectory of development. So if we look at the ecological aspect, then we can find the main contradictions and paradoxes of development in China. So I will give you two examples. One example is what just now Auyeung and Seung mentioned. There's the two women who have done exemplary work in ecological issues. And she quoted the woman who has worked on the Han River project of reducing the pollution. That lady, she lives in near Wuhan, which is in the middle of China, and her city, Xiang is very near the Danjiangkou reservoir, where the government is doing this huge project of diverting water from the south to the north. The reason for diverting the water is because we have a drought in the northern areas with Beijing, Tianjin, and the Hebei provinces. But then we have a lot of floods and the rivers. We have the rivers basically in the south. So in order to keep the urbanized population in Tianjin and Beijing, in order not to have to move the capital to somewhere else with water, so the government decided to embark on these huge mega projects of diverting water. So the idea was to build three main routes: the central route, the eastern route, and the western route, to transport the water, to channel the water from the south to the north. The eastern route, then it goes along the eastern part of China, and it had to overcome some difficulties, such as they have to raise the water to a certain level, and so the water had to go by 13 steps upwards until it came to a particular place where it could flow to the north. For the central route, the problem is not so severe because the water basically could be collected in the reservoir, in the Danjiangkou reservoir, and that from there then it could flow all the way to Beijing, to the Tianjin and the Hebei provinces. However, it will be drawing 1/4 to 1/3 of the Han River, the water of the Han River, so as to channel that to the north, and that would be about 10 billion cubic meters per year. So for this lady, Yun Jianli, who lives by the Han River, the problem for them would be that, well, if 1/3 of the water or maybe 1/4 of the water is diverted, so they would face a very serious water shortage. And all the ensuing problems when you don't have the usual flow of the water and the flushing. So there would be a whole series of problems when the volume of water becomes small. So she has been engaged in this campaign together with the people from her city and the volunteers and the teachers and students in order to campaign. Well, one is for water to be rechanneled back to them from other tributaries, and the second question is for water to be decontaminated. The pollution of water in China, it has been very serious due to all the industries and mining and also the urbanization with all the urban waste. So in the year 2000, we have a very serious problem of pollution. We have 7 major rivers in China. But then in the year 2000, 40% of these 7 major rivers had the water above the grade 5. Grade 5 is the worst pollution. Grade 1 is good water. Water for grade 1 and grade 2, it is drinkable. Grade 3 water is already not drinkable. But then in China, in the year 2000, 40% from the 7 major rivers were above grade 5. So you can imagine the pollution. So that also forced the government to do the remedial measures to clean the water. And so 10 years later, in 2010, well, half the water has been cleaned. So only 20% of the water was above grade 5. But still, it's very serious, but a little bit better than before. But then even now, after all the efforts of the government to clean up the water, over 40% of the water is still grade 3 or above. That means that it's not drinkable. China, although we say that it has a huge population, it seems to have a lot of resources, yet we have a very serious problem of water shortage. China, we have the per capita access to fresh water is only 1/4 of the world average. The per capita access to water, to fresh water, is only 25% of the world average because of all the deserts, the uneven distribution of water, etc. So 25% of China's population does not have access to clean, fresh water. And with the rivers so polluted, so what do people do? What can people do? You drill wells to have access to the underground water. So, for example, for Beijing, because of the population, now Beijing has a population of over 20 million people. So the rivers around Beijing are so polluted that they cannot be used anymore. So then the government has this idea of channeling water from the south to the north. And still, we see that in the 10 years between the year 2000 and the year 2010, the underground water level in Beijing has dropped from 12 meters to 24 meters. So you can imagine the seriousness of the issue. That in Beijing, the water level has gone down. In Tianjin, it's the same because people were also getting the underground water. And so there are so many places with collapses. because of the underground. So in a way, we can understand why the government has this project to divert water from the south to the north. Because that is to the privilege and to the safeguarding and guaranteeing the livelihood of people from Tianjin, Beijing, and Hebei provinces. But then at the same time, we see that such channeling of water is also very damaging for the people from the south, who would now go without water. And of course, we have all the environmental issues because because most rivers in China flow from the west to the east. Whereas if you have to channel the water like that, 10 billion cubic meters of water from the south to the north, you have to cut across all the streams and the tributaries and especially the Yellow River. So what do? For example, for the eastern route, they have to, when the water from the south, from the Yangtze River come to the Yellow River, they dig a tunnel. So the water from the Yangtze River goes under the tunnel over in order to cross the Yellow River. Or in certain places, they would be building huge pipes above the ground in order for the water to flow. So you can imagine the kind of cost, the monetary cost for these projects. So the monetary cost for these two routes alone is already 2 times the cost of the Three Gorges Dam project. And but then from these projects, we can somehow understand the dilemmas that the government is in, because if you do not try to bring the water from the south to the north, then the capital, the people in the capital would go without water. But then if you do that, then you have also a lot of consequences, and the project itself may not work eventually because of the silt staying in the pipes, in the rivers, and because of a lot of other problems. Of course, there are people saying that if we could recycle 1/3 of the water used in the big cities, that is already enough for their consumption, and you do not need all these projects. But then I think we will all know how difficult it is to talk to the new middle class in Beijing, in Tianjin, in these metropolitan cities, who have benefited from the new lifestyle, new living way. They have the cars, they have the washing machines, they have all these, which would all need so much water. So this example is to say the kind of contradictions we see, but then the logic behind it is that it's always at the expense of the most marginalized groups, at the expense of the smaller cities, smaller towns, in favor of an elite minority, in favor of the metropolitan middle class. And so we see this kind of project. But to just very quickly give you another example of the kind of contradictions in the development. So there was one documentary 2 years ago which drew a lot of attention in China. It's called Under the Dome. I think many of you might have heard of it, 穹顶之下. So it was a documentary about air pollution by the journalist Jade. And when it was put on the internet in China, I think there was 200 million hits within the week in China. That means 1 in 3 netizens in China had access and had seen the documentary. So in the documentary, it talked about the serious air pollution in China, about the PM 2.5 levels. But then the problem is the government, of course, also see the problem, because China is also a place where the lung cancer rate is 2 times the world average. We have about, in China, we have 20% of the world population. We have 40% of the lung cancer mortality in the whole world. So we see and the lung cancer, it affects not just the poor, it also affects the people in the cities. So the government then embarked on projects to try to clean up the air. So one idea of cleaning up the air is to forbid the burning of coal, of coarse coal, during the winter months. In China, the burning, there is estimated to be 10 million coal burners in the different families who do not have access to gas or electricity for the heating. And in the north, in China, it could be quite cold. Right? It could be below 10, 15 degrees in the winter. So for 4 months every year, you need the heating. And so about, so with the 10 million small coal burners, of course, that would emit a lot of and then contaminate the air. And so that's, but the estimate is that they would burn 300,000 tons of coal every day. So you can imagine but then who is using these coal burners? It's mostly the poor. Because if you live in condominiums, apartments, then you have access to the central heating. But then if you are dispersed rural households, then you do not have this access. And the other problem is if you use the gas, you say, okay, you do not burn those coal, you can use the gas. But then shifting from you burning coal to burning to using gas, it would be 3 times the cost. So a family using the gas, they would have to spend $1,000 for the 4 months in winter. Yeah. But then it is simply not affordable for the poor. But then, so the government was saying that it will do away with all the coal. So it announced a no coal zone for China, for the north, for 2 main cities plus 26 cities. So for 28 cities, this year, just last year, at the end of last year, it will be a no coal zone. So the government was very strict in imposing this policy. So starting from November, in October, November last year, the government banned the use of coal, burning coal, and then this helped destroy the coal burners. Then suddenly, people went without heating because there was also a 27% shortage in the gas supply. So this example is also one where we see that the poor and the marginalized are those who are paying for this cost. But then there are but then we cannot blame the government only. The government has the policies. Just now, Xiaohui was telling us that the president of China now has proposed the idea of de-urbanization. Of course, that is a good idea. De-urbanization and de-industrialization, putting in a lot of money for cleaning up the air, the soil, the water. And of course, if you count all the money that has gone into the cleaning up, that has contributed a lot to China's GDP growth. But then the question for us is, can we have a model or can we have a paradigm when we have this exit from capitalism or exit from the capitalist way of development, and we have the idea of degrowth? It's not only urbanization or deindustrialization, it's the whole idea, is the whole question about degrowth and reversing the whole logic of development and of modernization. And of course, there's also the necessity for demonetization. because, and so that is why for us, in the first presentation by Tsui, we talked about the rural reconstruction movement. So our proposal for alternatives is that we could have, we should be reviving community governance and management of the commons, of land which is now being individualized and work, or maybe they are being contracted by big companies. But can we be reviving communities so that they can be exercising the will and the capacity for managing the commons? And that is also why we have been proposing the idea of peasant agriculture. So, for example, I've co-edited this book on the struggle for food sovereignty, and Tsui is one of the authors for the China paper, which is also about the question of so-called development, not only for China but also for also globally, that the post-capitalist paradigm would be based on the question of peasant agriculture. So I would like to end my presentation here because in the afternoon we also have one session to talk about community experiences in different parts of the world, in Europe, in Japan, in Nepal, but we also have two case studies that we will be presenting about two communities in China that have been working very well, and people have been participating in a very democratic and voluntary way to manage the common. And so thank you for your patience. Maybe we could now go into the part about the questions or comments.
My question is, you loads have mentioned about the financial crisis and the impact of the global crisis and how China is dealing, also the issues regarding the human and the rural farmers in China, and also all of the issues regarding to the pollution, water, air. But then my question is, as many other countries, developing countries, they are growing, they want to develop, they want to grow as GDP. They are really concerned in the capitalism system. They want to develop industry, they want to earn profit, they want to earn money. But then how it is in terms of education, because as she said, in the new rich people, they want to have the good advantage. It's a new thing for them. They've never had these kind of things before. So how it is in China, for instance, that the education is facing it, how do they encourage, let's say, children or students from university to increase this kind of consciousness? Because it's a huge contrast. And then, because for instance, here in Brazil, we don't have it. It's nearly zero. Obviously, this forum is a huge event, but the reality in Brazil is not like that. We want to earn money. We don't really care about the pollution or whatever soever. How it is in China, this encouragement in students in the education field?
Yeah, thank you for your questions. It's a very good question. For example, I give some cases how some rural communities also deal with these problems. For example, that you mentioned, the young people like to go to city to earn more money, to enjoy luxury life in the city. Okay, I give you examples from our movement. Every year we set up different centers. We have the Liklu donkey farms. We have the Liangshu Ming Rural Reconstruction Center. And then these two also target how to teach our young people to return to the countryside and how to understand more what happened in our reality, particularly in the village or in the countryside. And for example, Xiaohui, I think he is the manager of the Little Donkey Farms. And then every year we have the internship program. That means we will encourage or to recruit some students, because you know that even now students and many young people actually lose interest to learn. And we try to promote or to provide some opportunities for them to do farming. Even in Lingnan University, we also have the Lingnan gardeners to encourage the student to do the farming. Because in the dominant ideology, we think that the labor, it is a very bad thing. We're supposed to do the office work, not to do something dirty work. So how to change that, the so-called dirty work, to do the work with your hand, with your mind, and with your feet, hand, and with your heart. So how can teach them how to deal with the relation with the earth? So we through the encourage the natural farming or the organic farming, anything to do the farming first, to understand the importance of labor, because it's also related to the question how we treat the working class. Because, for example, the cleaner, the factory worker, we never think that they are very important, because we worship the so-called professional like doctor, lawyer, and also the speculator, or to someone doing earn much more money in the stock market. We worship this kinds of successful businessmen. But how we deal with the ordinary people or working class? The first point, we try to let the student to do the farm work first, to provide opportunities to learn farming, to do labor work or to do the dirty work. For example, in Yeung community, they persuade the university student to collect the rubbish door by door, or to let them understand how they have to do the so-called the dirty work. That means through the dirty work, they have opportunity to do the home visits, to talk with the peasants, and then even they think that they are not no more privileged anymore. You are same with the ordinary people. So this is one point, how we change the concept of the dirty work. That's one. Two, how to do the physical labor. Second. And the third one is how to integrate, to being together with the community. So we, Liang Shunming Rural Center also provide some training programs to let them to stay in the countryside for 1 year. Even you are a university student, you are not yet graduate, but during the summer or during the winter internship, that means we provide some internship or 1 year program. That means let them, every month we give some very small amount of subsidies, and then let them to live and work together with their peasant families. So at least in their daily life, they have to understand more what's the problems that peasants have confront, what's their concern, and not to educate the peasant, but learn from the peasant. So we have to change their mindset. Because you are not from the city, so you are privileged. No, we encourage them. You have to learn from the poor, from the people first. But I'm not saying that they are the poor because they are they're entitled, they are represent justice. No, but at least you have to change your mindset. You are not a privileged people. You are privileged because in dominant ideology, you come from the city, you are educator, you are Western educator, so you are privileged people. That's all. But in reality, no. Because we think that why we enjoy privilege, because some others are unprivileged. So how do we change the relation? We have to change our mind first. Yeah. So we provide many different activities. Let our young children be involved in the movement. This is a long process. Even in Brazil, as far as I understand, MST, the landless worker movement, also not only they do the land occupation, to fight for the land rights, but at the same time they also generate many education programs to let the university and also the movement, they join together and to provide training program for the young people.
I'm trying to understand the grassroots movements in China. How are they organized? What is the political space for them to organize? Because we see most of the grassroots movements in other countries, political space is really shrinking. It's not easy to maneuver. The government is really constrained. So to me, it would be nice to know in China how these grassroots, how are they organized, how are they funded? Like, for example, these big companies that they pollute, do they also give money to NGOs? And does NGO take that money? What is the moral discussion around it? So that is one question. The second question is to relate what is happening in China and what China now is doing outside in other countries. Especially when it comes to this deforestalization, because China is a big power now. You need resources in order to back your economy in China. And you go everywhere and you tap resources. To what extent what is happening in China is also influenced by what China does outside. And how does the social movement in China addresses the problem that China does outside China? And here I'm talking specifically of failure countries, Africa in particular, where China is going and they really do a lot of pollution. This is of the water. I can just change it to what I know what China is doing in Zambia. So if you could just take that would be really good. Maybe I need to ask you a question first.
Yeah.
That's what we hear. On the other hand, we hear the localized, and we hear that the government, the Communist Party, might allow open space for specific localized initiative, but when they try to get together, a big stick. So, is that your view of the situation, and what can you imagine further and later so that these local initiatives become a movement? Like here, I'm not saying it's the same situation, but once local initiatives and local movements not necessarily do the same thing, at least coordinate, then they are able to make adequate pressure and won't change. But if they don't do that, the results are very limited.
I would like to know your opinion about if not having a corrupt government or corrupt state is like a precondition to have a successful policy of land distribution, or if there is something.
Okay. Thank you very much for all your questions, and I try my best to respond. Yeah, and as far as I know, the so-called the grassroots movement, they whenever they initiate some projects, that they try to recruit different source of the funding. For example, from their community, they have do some small fundraising. For example, the Yeung communities, they try to raise their money by themselves. And then also they have some projects that depends on the project by project. They also have some money from the local government, or even from the central government, or they also receive some funding from the NGO. Take our rural reconstruction as an example. We all recruit the funding from different sectors, project by project. So, that means we do not depend on only one funder. So never no funder, no single funder dominate our projects. So that's why we consider us as a kind of social networking, but not a very concrete organization. So now actually we are all volunteer in that movement, but we get our salary, for example, from my university. But at the same time, I'm also the activist. And then we have the projects also get money from the local government, also from the NGO. Yeah, so it depends. Yeah, and for the question of the Chinese external investment, I mean, we are also concerned of this question, but we not have at very concrete research about that because our team basically focus on the macro history of the China, and also we try to do the initiate projects within the China to work with the majority peasant and workers. But for that part, I think I understand because it involves the how we relate with the other countries. Because in the last century, we are so-called the third world, and also the quite important country within the third world. And then how we deal with the other brother and sister of the developing countries. This is a very important question. But we have not yet very concrete research about the Chinese foreign investment. But what we have done for the long time, we initiate the people's exchange. For example, we have for example, the exchange program with the Peru. For example, we bring the indigenous people from the Peru to visit China, to visit our rural communities. That kind of people's exchange, we involve a lot, but not government, that's high level, the business level. So this is not our research interest, but we know that it's a very important question. And your Pierre question about the future, because in the it's my personal point of view. In terms of the financial capitalism, now is the next century will be the conflicts between the renminbi and the US dollar. So this is kind of the currency war. That's it, we can't avoid because it's out of the question of the capital, because it should be this kind of the conflicts within the financial capitalism. And then, but how we can avoid or to prevent this crisis happen, because it will create lots of the problems. That means we have to strengthen the peoples, the communities, to strengthen their capacity to resist this kind of crisis. That's, we think that we are not looking at the upper level, we are looking at the high level, but we consider the below. That means because sometimes we think that whenever we can strengthen the rural community, we have more energy or we have more space and choice for us to prevent the crisis. Yeah.
So a quick answer to some of the questions. One is the government, after all these urbanization efforts, for some time then it proposed to have the medium-scale towns and cities, so that people do not just go to the big cities, they would be going to the smaller cities. And then the government has this new policy of trying to contain the population of the big cities. But this also has a lot of consequences. So for example, just at the same time when they were converting the coal to the gas during that period, there was also one fire in the Daxing period. Actually, Xiaohui has written a lot about this case. What happened was the government was saying that because of this fire in which 19 people died, the government came up with a very strong push to demolish the slum-like living site. And then 3 million people were reported to be evicted from Beijing within 2 weeks. 3 million people. And of the 3 million, then the consequence is that, for example, then the idea of this whole project is to contain the population and also to keep Beijing clean. But then, I just give one example. We have about 150,000 to 300,000 scavengers in Beijing. That is the rural poor. Then they come to, well, we have in all over China about 3 million people working on scavenging. But then in Beijing, then you have this population, and most of them may have been evicted. But what is the consequence? The consequence is that they have been responsible, they have been working to recycle about 30% of the garbage in Beijing. But, and the garbage in Beijing, they produce 23,000 tons of garbage every day in Beijing. 23,000 tons. Because there's 20 million people, yeah. So you can imagine all this, but then the problem is when these scavengers are being evicted from Beijing, then you will have to burn more of the garbage. And 10 years ago, Beijing had only 1 waste incinerator. Now it has 11. But then if you use the waste incinerators, then you emit the dioxin. So you pollute the air again. So you see that we are in this cycle of polluting, you want to clean up, and then you want to clean up, you evict people, and then nobody takes care of the garbage, and then the problem comes back. So this policy of trying to contain the population, it is a government policy. It has quotas for every place, even every different district in Beijing. There is a quota of how much population that is. And so the government is enforcing this, and this has caused, of course, quite a lot of distress to different sectors of the population. We are just quoting certain examples, so for you to understand. Okay, about the question of organization. Maybe when we look at China, we do not see organization in the form of civil society from the Western point of view, the kind of human rights or the form of organizing. So, for example, in Hong Kong, then we have when there's some problem, then usually we have a march of the cleaners or the people wanting some change and campaigning for the government to do something. So the parade, the march, is very often one form of mobilization and organizing. In China, it is it's very different ways of organizing. So, for example, back to the scavengers, we have about 400 garbage sites around Beijing, in the periphery of Beijing. And each site is organized by the kinship relations. So, for example, the people, they come from Sichuan, then they are all here and they somehow dominate a particular garbage site, and they organize among themselves so that they can do the recycling, the sellings. And so kinship is still a very important factor in how people organize. And that has been from the People's Commune days, but then it also goes beyond the People's Commune days, because it's the traditional way of people relating to each other and organizing. So with the migrant workers, many of them would be going, so one family goes, and then all the relatives, the cousins, the uncles, then they all go to the same area. It happens the same way with factories. They go into certain factories, they do take up certain occupations. So this is a different kind of organizing, which may not be visible by the journalist. But then it is effective in certain ways. But of course, it has its own demerits. I also quoted the example of student organizations. It's a very vibrant sector. Actually, Xiaohui, he was in an environmental student group when he was doing his university studies. So he was going to different places to look at pollution, to come up with proposals. And then he was very disappointed with some of the new NGOs because he thought that they would be talking about environmental issues during their work. And then in the evenings, they would go to the bars to drink beer. And then he was very disdainful of that kind of lifestyle. So he didn't want to be involved in that kind of NGOs. And then he came to the rural reconstruction movement that we had. And so I think the main question is, if there are problems, especially then there is bound to be people organizing to defend their interests. And today the internet is very much all over China, because I think in China is so developed. You buy everything through your mobile phone. You have and so the access to internet is very popular in China. So you also see the government when you read in the news that the government is trying to crack down on certain things, to ban certain things from words from appearing in the internet. People would use different ways. They would use the similar sound to or similar other symbols to talk about the same things, and this cannot be controlled. But then when you see the effort or the attempt to control, then you can see what kind of problem is posed to the government. And in China, we can say that if we are still with the Cold War kind of understanding to look at China, then we see that China, the party state is autocratic and dominating. So in some sense, this has continued. But on the other hand, there's a lot of anarchy on the ground at different levels. So sometimes you hear the stories of corruption. You cannot believe it. They would find a place with a particular corrupt official. His whole room would be filled with the banknotes. And so we had the story of one very bankrupt official who was being arrested, and then they used a lot of these machines to count the paper notes to have an exact amount of how much money was found in his room, in his home. And then I think 10 of those machines burned out because they was working too hard. They were working too hard. Yeah. So you have all these stories, but then sometimes you learn about the corruption when they have been discovered by the government or when they go to court. And so corruption definitely exists. But then what form does it take and what kind of monitoring there is? There is for the benefit. The government itself would like to keep corruption under control or certain types of corruption under control. But then there are always ways for a small group to take advantage of the conditions, to be corrupt, to take things, to send the children overseas, to send all the money overseas, to go to Macau to gamble, and then to for the money laundering, etc. But then the question for us that concerns us is how can the majority of the people defend their own interests? And I think on the environmental question, so for example, this example about the lady, she managed to get the whole city behind her to do the anti-corruption and anti-contamination efforts. So they had their volunteer groups, and they say that when they go, then they do not get any money from the government. There's no money for this. So then they would be sleeping on the floors, and then what they do was they would be using mobilizing the students and the teachers and the residents to go to check during the night which are the polluting industries, and then taking pictures and then reporting using the media. So there are different ways in which people organize. Of course, if we look at the space for local initiatives, if these initiatives before, if they were among women's initiatives, environmental issues, then they had more tolerance than worker organizing, for example. So you have also different ways, and there are certain taboo areas that people wouldn't touch. For example, a particular province wanting to split away and become an independent nation. Those things you can't see in the internet, and that would be a political challenge. But then in terms of people defending their economic rights, then you have a lot of this going on. And I think the main question is how we can have a different paradigm. And you mentioned China's investments overseas. I think we have to change the wording because it's not China. If you look at China, 90% of the population has nothing really to do with the going out. They are themselves also exploited as miners, as the peasants in China itself. So it's the new block of interest groups with the finance, with maybe state money, state funds, and maybe with the new the new capitalists with their funds that are going to different places and then also exploiting the resources. And it's the same logic internally and overseas. It's the same logic. So what we are saying is that there has to be a paradigm shift. There has to be a restriction, a constraint on the way the middle class would be spending. There has to be a whole different way of working. And when now China is facing such a lot of crises and such a lot of problems, it's also the opportunities to raise alternatives, to pose alternatives. And we as with faith in communism, not being a party member, but we have faith in communism because we find the evils and the ills of capitalism. So I feel that in China, because of the problems of induced by this capitalist way of development, there is more need for the Chinese peasants and workers and women to be linked to the groups outside, to be against the multinationals and Chinese capital being part of that, and to fight for a way where we have the not only socio-economic justice, but also ecological justice. And the two is not separate from each other, they are interdependent. Well, thank you very much.